You think they'll hire you?
I hope so.
Jacob Miller?
Don't move! Go! Save yourself!
What do I owe you? The day I applied for a ranch hand job.
The day Jacob Miller applied for a ranch hand job, he believed he had already lost everything. He had no idea that the wealthiest ranch owner in Texas had spent nearly 20 years waiting to hear his name. The drought had lasted longer than anyone expected. For 2 years, the Texas sun had burned through pastures, dried up water sources, and destroyed ranches that had survived for generations. Jacob Miller's ranch wasn't supposed to survive either. He had sold cattle, sold equipment, sold everything he could sell without destroying the last thing he still had: hope. But hope doesn't pay bank loans. And on that particular Tuesday morning, Jacob Miller was driving toward Whitmore Ranch because he had finally run out of options. His old pickup truck shook with every mile. The air conditioning had stopped working years earlier. The passenger door only opened from the outside, and in the seat beside him sat the only reason he hadn't given up: Emma, 8 years old, boots too big for her feet, hat too big for her head, and somehow a smile still big enough to make him believe everything would eventually be all right. "Dad?" Jacob kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah? You think they'll hire you?" He smiled, not because he believed it, because she did. "I hope so." Emma nodded seriously. "I think they will." He wished he had her confidence, because the truth was, Jacob hadn't applied for a job in over 20 years. He had spent most of his adult life building something of his own: a small ranch, a family, a future. Then Sarah died, then the drought came, and suddenly, a man who had once believed he could survive anything found himself driving toward another person's ranch, hoping someone would give him a chance. Whitmore Ranch appeared on the horizon shortly after sunrise. Even after all these years, it still looked unreal. Thousands of acres, perfect fences, hundreds of horses, the kind of place people wrote books about, the kind of place men like Jacob usually admired from a distance. The parking area was already full: dozens of trucks, dozens of applicants, strong men, young men, men with better clothes, better equipment, better chances. Jacob parked at the far end, mostly because that was where his truck finally decided to stop running. Emma climbed out beside him. She reached for his hand, not because she was scared, because she knew he was. The line of applicants stretched nearly to the main barn. Jacob stood quietly. He had spent his entire life working. He had repaired fences, broken horses, engines, roofs, wagons. He knew how to survive. But standing in line, asking another man for work, felt harder than anything he had ever done. The other applicants noticed him immediately: his old truck, his worn boots, his faded shirt. One of them laughed. "Looks like somebody brought his kid to a job interview." Several others smiled. Jacob ignored them. Then another man looked at Emma. "You know this isn't charity, right?" The words hung in the air. Emma lowered her eyes. For a moment, Jacob almost answered. Almost. But he remembered something Sarah used to tell him: pride doesn't feed children. So he remained silent. And somehow, that hurt more. Minutes later, movement spread across the ranch entrance. Employees stood straighter. Managers stopped talking. Everyone turned. Eleanor Whitmore had arrived, the wealthiest ranch owner in Texas. She walked through the crowd carrying a stack of applications. No security, no assistance, just Eleanor. She greeted employees, shook hands, reviewed paperwork. Then she stopped, completely, her eyes fixed on a single application. She read it once, then again. The color disappeared from her face. The manager beside her looked confused. "Miss Whitmore?" She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes searched the crowd. Then she spoke. Not loudly, but loudly enough that everyone heard. "Jacob Miller?" The entire ranch became silent. Jacob looked up. Emma squeezed his hand. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eleanor took a step forward. She looked at him as though she had just seen a ghost. And in a way, perhaps she had, because the name Jacob Miller wasn't supposed to appear at Whitmore Ranch. Not after 20 years. Not after all the searching. Not after all the promises her father had died trying to keep. To everyone standing in the hiring line at Whitmore Ranch, Jacob Miller looked like a man who had lost. A worn hat, faded jeans, an old pickup truck barely holding itself together. A young daughter holding his hand. Nothing about him suggested that he had once been a man other people depended on. Nothing about him suggested that, years earlier, entire counties across Texas had known his name. And that was exactly how Jacob wanted it. At 42 years old, Jacob Miller no longer cared about being respected. He cared about Emma. He cared about paying bills. He cared about keeping the small ranch that had become the last physical memory of the life he had built with Sarah. Everything else had stopped mattering a long time ago. The drought had taken almost everything. First the grass, then the cattle, then the savings, then the certainty that hard work alone could solve every problem. For 2 years, Jacob had fought against something no man could defeat: the weather. He repaired fences himself, worked nights repairing equipment for neighboring ranches, sold horses he loved, sold equipment he needed, sold pieces of his future to protect Emma's present. But eventually, every man reaches a moment when pride becomes a luxury. Applying for work at Whitmore Ranch had become that moment. Emma didn't understand all of it, and Jacob thanked God every day for that. At 8 years old, Emma believed their ranch was the most beautiful place in Texas. She loved horses. She loved sunsets. She loved listening to old stories while sitting beside her father in the workshop. And she had inherited something else, something Sarah had possessed until her final day: kindness. The kind of kindness that survives pain, the kind that refuses to become bitterness. Sometimes, late at night, Jacob would watch Emma helping injured animals or sharing food with neighbors and realize something that both comforted and terrified him. She was becoming exactly like her mother. Sarah used to say something that Jacob had never forgotten: the strongest people are the ones nobody notices. When he was younger, he had disagreed. He believed strength was something people saw: a badge, a reputation, a title. Then he met Sarah, and she taught him that real strength usually happened quietly. It happened when nobody was watching. It happened when a person chose kindness despite pain. It happened when someone kept going after losing everything. After Sarah died, Jacob stopped talking about his own past, at first because it hurt, then because it no longer seemed important. Emma knew her father had once done something different before becoming a rancher. She knew he had traveled. She knew people occasionally recognized him. She knew there was an old locked box in his workshop that he never opened. But she never asked questions, maybe because she understood that some wounds don't disappear. They simply become part of the person carrying them. And Jacob never volunteered answers. He never told Emma about the years before the ranch. He never told her about the investigations, the manhunts, the nights spent searching for people who didn't want to be found. He never told her about the badge he had hidden away after Sarah died, and he certainly never told her about William Whitmore, because some memories remain painful even after 20 years. The truth was, Jacob had met William Whitmore long before Whitmore Ranch became famous, long before the private jets, long before the newspapers called him the king of Texas ranching. Back then, William had simply been another rancher trying to survive, just like Jacob, but Jacob had spent 20 years believing that whatever happened between them had been forgotten, not because William was a bad man, because life moves on, people get older, families grow, promises disappear, and memories fade. At least that's what Jacob had told himself. He had to believe that, because believing anything else would have hurt too much. Standing in the hiring line that morning, watching wealthy ranch managers walk past him without noticing him, Jacob felt strangely relieved. He didn't want special treatment. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted work, a chance, a paycheck, a future for Emma. He glanced down at her. She smiled. "Dad?" He looked at her. "Yeah? You still look nervous." He laughed softly. "That obvious?" She nodded. Mom always said nervous people tell the truth. The words hit him harder than she realized, because Sarah had said that, hundreds of times. He smiled. Your mom was usually right. Emma squeezed his hand. Then everything will be okay. Jacob wished he believed that, because at that exact moment Eleanor Whitmore was still staring at his name, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, someone had finally discovered what Jacob Miller had spent most of his life trying to forget. The problem was, Jacob still believed William Whitmore had forgotten that night a very long time ago. When Eleanor Whitmore said the name Jacob Miller, the entire hiring yard fell silent. Not because anyone there recognized him, because they recognized her. The wealthiest ranch owner in Texas had just looked at a struggling ranch hand applicant as though she had seen a ghost. Jacob felt Emma tighten her grip on his hand. He didn't understand. Not yet. Neither did Eleanor. Because in that moment, she wasn't seeing the tired cowboy standing in front of her. She was seeing her father. 20 years earlier, back when William Whitmore wasn't William Whitmore. Back when he was simply a rancher trying to survive. The spring floods of that year had become part of Texas history. Entire roads disappeared, bridges collapsed, families abandoned their homes, and somewhere deep inside a narrow canyon, nearly 200 miles from where Whitmore Ranch stood today, William Whitmore made the worst decision of his life. He tried to cross anyway. At the time, William owned fewer than 200 acres, no private helicopters, no managers, no fortune, just cattle, debt, and a family depending on him. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. The river rose, the road disappeared, and within minutes, William's truck had been pushed against the canyon wall. The water kept rising. His radio failed, his engine died, and for the first time in his life, William Whitmore realized he was going to die. Later, he would write that the strangest part wasn't the fear. It was the silence. The realization that the world simply continues moving while one person waits for everything to end. He spent nearly 3 hours trapped, 3 hours watching the water climb higher, 3 hours believing nobody knew where he was. Then he heard something impossible, a horse. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Then he heard a voice, a young man's voice. "Don't move!" William looked up. Standing on the edge of the canyon was a cowboy who couldn't have been more than 22 years old. Young, thin, wearing a hat that looked too old for him, and holding a rope. That young man was Jacob Miller. Back then, Jacob wasn't a ranch owner. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even a man with a plan. He was simply someone returning home after a cattle delivery when he noticed broken fencing near the canyon. Most people would have turned around. Jacob didn't. The rescue should have been impossible. The current was too strong. The canyon walls were unstable. The horse nearly lost its footing twice. But Jacob never stopped. Years later, William would write that the thing he remembered most wasn't the danger. It was Jacob's face. He wasn't acting like a hero. He wasn't acting brave. He looked annoyed, as though saving a stranger in a flood was simply another problem that needed solving. 3 hours later, William Whitmore walked out of that canyon alive, because one young cowboy had decided to risk everything for someone he had never met. At the hospital, William tried to pay him. Jacob refused. William offered money, land, employment, anything. Jacob smiled, then said something William never forgot. "If you're alive, that's enough." Before leaving, William made a promise. He shook Jacob's hand, and he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "One day, I'll repay this debt." Then life happened. Years passed. William built an empire. Jacob built a family. The two men never saw each other again. But William Whitmore never forgot. Not once. He hired investigators, asked old friends, tracked rumors, followed records. Whenever he traveled across Texas, he asked the same question. "Has anyone seen Jacob Miller?" Eventually, people assumed he would stop searching. He never did. And when William Whitmore died, Eleanor discovered something no one else knew existed, an entire room filled with records, maps, letters, investigation reports, and one file larger than all the others. The file labeled Jacob Miller. Inside was a handwritten instruction, simple, clear. and underlined twice. If Jacob Miller ever appears, help him before he asks for help. Standing in the hiring yard, Eleanor suddenly understood why her father had never stopped searching. Because some debts become part of who we are. She looked at Jacob. Older now, tired, wearing worn boots, standing beside a little girl who looked at the world with the same kindness her father once had. And for the first time in 20 years, William Whitmore's promise had finally found its way home. But not everyone at Whitmore Ranch was happy about it, because while Eleanor saw a man her father had spent decades trying to find, someone else saw a threat. And at the far end of the yard, Victor Kane had just realized that Jacob Miller was not supposed to be there. Victor Kane sensed the danger before anyone else. While the candidates still whispered in the courtyard of Whitmore Ranch and Emma tried to understand why everyone was suddenly staring at her father, Victor watched everything from the balcony of the administrative office. He didn't know Jacob Miller personally, but he knew that name, and that was enough. For years, Victor had worked alongside the Whitmore family as an investor, external advisor, and manager of major contracts. To the public, he was simply a smart businessman helping Eleanor modernize the ranch after her father's death. But behind closed doors, Victor wanted much more. He wanted influence. He wanted land. He wanted seats on the board. He wanted to turn parts of Whitmore Ranch into businesses William would never have approved while he was alive. And above all, Victor wanted Eleanor to depend on him, so when she recognized the name of a poor cowboy standing in line for a simple ranch hand position, Victor realized there was a problem. This wasn't just another candidate, it was Jacob Miller, the man William Whitmore had searched for over 20 years, the man tied to an old promise, the man who could make Eleanor believe in her father's values again, exactly when Victor needed her to forget them. That same afternoon, the rumors began, first among the stable workers, then among the managers, then throughout the town. They said Jacob had shown up at Whitmore Ranch because he knew William had died. They said he was using Emma to gain sympathy. They said maybe he had invented the entire rescue story. They said a man in debt always appears when he smells money. Jacob heard some of it. Emma heard other parts. But he didn't react. He didn't defend his name. He didn't confront anyone. He simply worked. And that irritated Victor even more, because guilty men expect shouting. They expect anger. They expect desperation. Jacob offered silence. And silence, when it comes from a patient man, can be far more dangerous. In the following days, Victor changed his strategy. He called Eleanor into a private meeting. He placed documents on the table. He spoke in a low, careful voice, as if trying to protect her. Eleanor, your father was an honorable man, he said, but guilt can make even honorable men believe stories they shouldn't. She looked at him without responding. Victor continued. Jacob Miller is bankrupt. He showed up exactly when he needed help. Maybe your father searched for the wrong man. Maybe this Jacob discovered the story and decided to use it. Eleanor didn't like the accusation, but Victor knew how to plant doubt. That was his talent. He didn't need to convince her all at once. He just needed the question to linger. That night, an anonymous employee left a folder in Eleanor's office. Inside were supposed financial records of Jacob, debts, liens, late payments, false notes suggesting he had researched the Whitmore family before arriving at the ranch. Everything looked too organized, too clean, too convenient. Jacob noticed that immediately when Eleanor, visibly uncomfortable, showed him the papers. He read every page without expression. Then he placed the folder back on the table. Who delivered this? Eleanor replied. No one knows. Jacob looked out the window toward the pastures of Whitmore Ranch. For a moment, he seemed simply tired, but inside, something old had awakened. The indebted cowboy disappeared. The father remained. But behind him, the man who had spent years following trails others ignored returned. Jacob Miller began to investigate, not officially, not publicly, the way he always had when he wore a badge. He compared dates, checked signatures, spoke with longtime employees, watched who avoided his gaze, analyzed supplier records, delayed payments, and contracts revised after William's death. Slowly, a picture began to form. and it was much bigger than rumors about a cowboy. Money was disappearing. Small amounts in maintenance accounts, transfers disguised as administrative fees, lease contracts altered without full board approval, shell companies buying land near Whitmore Ranch, false appraisals lowering the value of strategic properties. Everything pointed to the same center, Victor Kane. Jacob wasn't surprised. Men like Victor rarely strike just once. They prepare the ground. They create fear. They isolate the victim. Then they appear offering a solution that is, in truth, the trap. That was exactly what he had tried to do with Eleanor. First, weaken her confidence, then discredit anyone who could help her. Finally, gain enough control to turn William's legacy into profit. Jacob worked in silence for 3 nights. Emma noticed. She found him in the small guest room Eleanor had temporarily offered, sitting at the table surrounded by papers. "Dad?" He looked up. She was in her pajamas, holding the old stuffed horse Sarah had sewn years ago. "Are you in trouble?" Jacob smiled tiredly. "I'm trying to stop one." Emma looked at the documents. "Is it because of that man?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Sometimes bad people try to make good people doubt themselves." Emma stayed quiet for a moment. "Mom used to say good people don't need to shout to be strong." The words hit Jacob deeper than she realized. Sarah always appeared like that. Through their daughter's voice, through her gestures, through the kindness she had left behind. Jacob closed the folder. She was right. The next morning, he went to William Whitmore's old office. It was a room Eleanor rarely used. Everything remained exactly as her father had left it. Old books, maps, family photos, a hat hanging on the wall. Jacob didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew men like William. Men who built empires with their hands tended to hide secrets the same way they stored tools, always in simple places, always close to their work. He examined drawers, folders, books. Then he noticed something on the wall behind the desk, an old photograph of a young William standing beside a truck nearly destroyed by mud. The photo was crooked. Jacob stepped closer. Behind it was a small opening in the wood. Inside, an envelope, yellowed, sealed, hidden for years. On the front, in William Whitmore's firm handwriting, there was only one sentence. "If they try to turn my daughter against Jacob Miller, give her this." Jacob held the envelope in silence, because in that moment he understood that William hadn't just searched for him. William had also known that one day someone would try to prevent the truth from reaching Eleanor. The emergency meeting at Whitmore Ranch drew more people than anyone expected. By sunrise, trucks lined the entrance road for nearly a mile. Employees, ranchers, attorneys, town council members, business owners, neighbors who had known William Whitmore their entire lives. Everyone had heard the rumors. Some believed Jacob Miller had manipulated the Whitmore family. Others believed Victor Kane was finally going to assume greater control of the ranch. And a few still believed that William Whitmore's final promise had been nothing more than an old man's regret. Only one person in the room knew the truth: Jacob Miller. The meeting was held in the main assembly hall. At the front sat Eleanor Whitmore. Beside her were the attorneys, the board members, the financial advisors, and, sitting with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, Victor Kane. He smiled when Jacob entered. He stopped smiling when he saw the envelope. The room slowly fell silent. Eleanor stood first. Her voice trembled. "My father spent 20 years searching for one man." She looked toward Jacob. "Today, I think we're finally going to understand why." Jacob walked to the front of the room, carrying a small stack of documents. No dramatic entrance, no anger, no speeches, just evidence. The first records were financial, transfers, shell companies, property acquisitions, unauthorized revisions to Whitmore Ranch contracts. Then came witness statements, former employees, contractors, managers who had remained silent because they feared losing their jobs. Each testimony revealed another piece of the same truth. Victor Kane had spent years preparing to gain control of Whitmore Ranch, not through business, through manipulation. Then Jacob presented the forged records, the false reports about his debts, the fabricated investigations, the anonymous files designed to turn Eleanor against him. Victor remained calm, or at least he tried to, because men like Victor always believe one thing, that the truth can be managed. Then Jacob placed William Whitmore's envelope on the table. For the first time that morning, Victor looked afraid. Eleanor carefully broke the seal. The room became silent enough to hear the wind outside. She unfolded the letter and began to read. If you are reading this, then someone has tried to make you doubt Jacob Miller. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor continued, "Do not believe them." She stopped for a moment, not because she wanted to, because she could barely breathe. Then she continued reading. 20 years ago, Jacob Miller saved my life when he had nothing. The room remained silent. He was young. He was poor. He owed me nothing. And yet he chose to save me anyway. Several employees lowered their heads. Some already had tears in their eyes. Eleanor kept reading. I spent 20 years trying to repay that debt. Not because Jacob ever asked. Because honorable men never do. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If Jacob Miller ever needs help, help him before he asks. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, because everyone understood. William Whitmore had never forgotten. Not once. Not for a single day. The letter continued, and with every paragraph, Victor Kane's future disappeared. William had documented everything, his suspicions, his concerns, his discoveries, the altered contracts, the financial manipulations, the pressure campaigns, the attempts to isolate Eleanor after his death. He had known not everything, but enough to understand that Victor Kane was never trying to help the Whitmore family. He was trying to inherit what he had never earned. When Eleanor finished reading, she couldn't continue. The room remained silent. Then Sheriff Harrison slowly stood. He looked at Victor, then at the evidence, then back at Victor. I believe we're finished here. Victor attempted to speak. He talked about misunderstandings, business strategy, miscommunication. Nobody listened, because for the first time in years, nobody was afraid of him anymore. Two investigators approached. Victor Kane left the room without looking back, and with him went 20 years of lies. The silence that followed felt different, lighter, as though everyone in the room had finally exhaled. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found Jacob standing outside the main barn. Emma and Noah were feeding carrots to the horses, laughing, arguing, being children. For a moment, neither adult spoke. Then Eleanor handed him a folder. My father's estate prepared this. Jacob didn't take it. It's yours. She shook her head. It belongs to you. Inside were financial documents, land deeds, partnership agreements, more money than Jacob had ever seen. He looked at the papers, then he looked at Emma. Finally, he smiled. I didn't come here because your father owed me anything. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Then why did you come? Jacob watched Emma laughing beside Noah. Because sometimes the simplest answers are the truest. I came because she needed a future. For several seconds, Eleanor couldn't speak, because in that moment, she understood exactly why her father had spent 20 years searching for Jacob Miller. Not because Jacob had saved his life, because Jacob had saved it without expecting anything in return. Months later, as the sun set over Whitmore Ranch, Emma and Noah fed the horses together. Jacob worked in the new restoration workshop William had once dreamed of building, not as an employee, not as a partner, as family. The valley glowed gold beneath the Texas sunset. And for the first time in many years, Jacob Miller finally understood something. He thought he was applying for a ranch hand job. He never realized he was walking back into a promise made 20 years earlier. If someone saved your life years ago, would you spend the rest of your life trying to repay that debt? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, honor, second chances, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.